In this presentation, you'll learn when to quote versus when to summarize, how to maximize the impact of summarized information from studies, and how to incorporate quotations into your writing.
Once you've decided that you need proof, then you have to decide whether you should quote from the reading or present summarized details from the reading. There are only certain circumstances where you should decide to use a quotation, and that is, are the words vivid and powerful? Usually that means that they're metaphors, they're images, they're words that convey emotion. If the words are vivid, it's a good idea to quote them. And the other circumstance in which you'd use a quote is when the words themselves prove the point. Press pause and read this excerpt from Megan McArdle's article, Is College a Lousy Investment? Which part of the passage do you think you should quote? Press pause and read this student rewrite. As you can see, the student has summarized all the basic facts from that paragraph. The only part the student has quoted is the part that says the federal government has started dropping money out of airplanes. The reason the student quoted that is the most vivid part of the previous excerpt. It's the part in which the writer is using a metaphor for the government freely giving away money, and she's comparing that to them dropping money out of airplanes. So the creativity of that statement is preserved, and the rest, which is just information, is summarized. Again, pause this slide and read this excerpt from that same article by Megan McArdle. Read this student rewrite of that article. You can see how little of the article, of that paragraph, the student has quoted. She's just quoted 4 words from that entire paragraph. And that's because the rest of the paragraph merely communicates information that can be summarized and should be summarized. The part that the student has quoted is the part that preserves Richard Vedder's voice and his emotional reaction. And so she's kept that part. And it's perfectly acceptable to use such partial quotations. In fact, I encourage it because it helps you to cut down on quoting.
Another circumstance in which you would quote is when the words themselves prove the point. So this is relevant when you're making a point about communication, about how something is said or how something is written. So you can see that that's a circumstance that won't happen all that often, but it does happen. Let's look at this example. Pause the slide and read the claim and support. As you can see, the part that is quoted is Alan Greenspan's testimony. And the reason that is quoted, even though those words are not vivid, in fact, they're the opposite of vivid. They're obscure, they're wordy, but the reason they're quoted is because they themselves prove the point of the claim. The claim is that government bureaucrats communicate obscurely, and that quote is a perfect illustration of that claim. So it's showing the reader this rather than telling them, and it communicates the point much more clearly than if the student had tried to somehow summarize that information. It is the proof. So another circumstance in which you would use that is, let's say you are critiquing a piece of literature, or, maybe let's say a poem, for instance, and you want to bring out how the poet writes very vividly, or you want to bring out something positive. Well, in that case, of course, you would have to quote to prove that it is the evidence. So in that somewhat rare circumstance in which you are making a point, your claim is about communication itself, you would have to quote to prove the point.
Sometimes you might find that you want to use a quote, but you don't need the entire quotation. You just need part of it. One way to deal with that and cut out the parts you don't need is to use ellipsis marks. You've probably seen these often when you're reading. It's the 3 little dots that indicate to readers that the writer is leaving something out of the quotation. So pause this slide and read the excerpt from the student essay as well as the revision. You can see in the revised version that the student has kept the two parts of the quotation that prove the point she wants to make, the first and the last part. She's left out the middle part. Just be careful when you do this, when you use ellipsis marks, that even though you're leaving out content, that the rest of what you have is grammatical. In this case, the revised version, it is, because the student has used two full sentences, one from the beginning of the quote, one from the end of the quote, so it's still grammatical. Well, what if you did not include a quotation and you want to summarize facts from the article? How do you do that? One of the challenges is summarizing statistics. How do you summarize statistics? Oftentimes I will see students quoting large you know, paragraphs of statistics when indeed that information should have been summarized. Let's just look at one example. In the top there, that's from Marty Nemco's America's Most Overrated Product. He quotes the statistic that 27% of all undergraduate students binge drink regularly. Now, if you wanted to include that statistic in your paper, how would you do that without quoting it? Well, just kind of think about what the statistic is communicating. 27%, that's a little over a quarter. So you could phrase it that way. You can say, NIMCO cites a 2000 study indicating that binge drinking is a standard practice for more than a quarter of undergraduates. Or how else might you indicate that figure? Well, you could say more than 1 in 4. You could say that way. Approximately 1 in 4 undergraduates habitually binge drink. So just think about the statistic and how you might rephrase it. And if you don't need the exact number, if it's not important to get the exact number, then you could probably rephrase it as an approximation.
When you're discussing or summarizing a study to include in your paper, it gives more validity to the information if you include some details of the study. Let's look at a contrast of how a student included information from a study. If we look at this, we see that the student included the author of the study but did not include any details of the study. By contrast, just by adding a section at the beginning of this sentence that includes some details of how many people were studied and the year in which they were studied, automatically the information has more validity. So if you can, please be sure to include a few details of the study that you're citing. In all cases, whether you summarize or quote, always use the full name of the source when you first mention the source and briefly indicate the relevant credentials of that source. If you do not indicate the relevant credentials of a source when you first mention it, readers will have no reason to trust the information that you're presenting from that source. Mentioning the credentials of the source establishes that source's authority on that topic.
At this point, let's talk about how to incorporate quotations within your paper. Let's say you decide you need a quotation. Well, how do you put it in your paper? We're going to discuss three correct ways to put the quotations in your paper. Pause this slide and look at these 4 excerpts. They're the same in content pretty much, but I want you to see if you can tell the difference in how the quotations are included in each one. Can you see the difference? The first one, the student's full sentence is followed by a colon, then the quote. In the second one, the student's full sentence is on its own. There's a period at the end, and then the quote is on its own sentence. The third one, the student has blended the quotation into his or her sentence. And in the fourth one, the student has used a signal phrase, Edmondson asserts, and then presented the quotation. Number 1, number 3, and number 4 are correct. Number 2 is incorrect, and we're going to discuss that on the following slides. The first method that is correct is using your own full sentence and then putting a colon, the two dots, one over the other, and then putting the quote that proves the statement that you just made. So your own full sentence, colon, quotation. That's acceptable. Another acceptable way to include a quotation is to use a signal phrase and a comma and then the quote. So here we see Edmondson asserts, comma, and then the quotation about what Edmondson is asserting. That's also acceptable. Another way to include quotations is to blend the quotation grammatically into your own sentence. Oftentimes students will do this when they're using just a part of the quotation. And we see an example of this here. The student here has used the full quote, but you could also use this to use partial quotes and blend them into your sentence. This is a very sophisticated way of including quotations, and it helps to cut down on the length of quotations because you are mainly expressing the quote in your own words, and you're just including the parts of the rest of the quote, the vivid parts perhaps. You're blending those into your sentence. So this is a really nice way to quote. Should be avoided. It's called the dropped quotation. And it's when you have your own full sentence on its own and then you put a quotation on its own. A quotation should not be in its own sentence. It has to be introduced or blended in some way, as the other three slides have mentioned. This is an unacceptable method, so you want to avoid it. What if you have a rare circumstance where you have to quote a larger passage of 4 lines or more? In MLA style, you would handle that by starting a new, almost like you're starting a new paragraph. You're not really, it's the same paragraph, but you're going on a different line and you're indenting the whole quotation 5 spaces and you're single spacing it. And you can see how this looks physically on the page here right in front of you. Um, in that case, you would not need quotation marks. Normally, in every other case, you would need quotation marks, but if you have a quotation of 4 lines or more, you do not need the quotation marks.
So to sum it up, use quotations for vivid words or when the words themselves prove the point. Summarize when you're just presenting basic facts or statistics. Keep quotations brief by blending quotations into your own sentences and using ellipsis marks when applicable. Briefly include details when you summarize the results of the study to give more validity to that information. Indicate a source's full name and relevant credentials when first mentioning that source. Finally, incorporate quotations correctly. Do not drop them into your writing.